Edward's wife Bridget dropped a divorce bomb on a Wednesday morning, and the timing couldn't have been more calculated or cold. He was sitting at their kitchen table, eating his usual bowl of cereal before heading off to work at the high school, where he taught shop class. The morning had started like any other, coffee brewing, birds chirping outside, the normalcy of 13 years of married life humming along predictably. Then Bridget walked into the kitchen, already dressed for work in one of her expensive business suits, her hair perfectly styled, makeup flawlessly applied. She looked like she was about to give a presentation to the board of directors, not end her marriage. Without any preamble, without even a good morning, or we need to talk, she set a manila folder down on the table next to his cereal bowl. The sound it made, that soft slap of paper against wood, would echo in Edward's memory for months afterward. She stood there, arms crossed, and told him in a voice devoid of emotion that she wanted a divorce. Just like that. As casually as if she were telling him they were out of milk, or that she'd be working late. There was no trembling in her voice, no tears in her eyes, no hesitation whatsoever. Edward stopped chewing mid-bite, a spoonful of cereal halfway to his mouth, and looked up at her. He searched her face for some sign of the woman he'd married, some hint of regret or sadness, or even anger. But there was nothing. Just a blank professional expression, like she was closing a business deal she'd been planning for months. She told him she'd already talked to a lawyer. Her lawyer, she emphasized, and that the folder contained all the terms of their divorce. She said they were fair. Fair. That word hung in the air between them like a bad joke. Edward's hands shook slightly as he opened the folder, his appetite completely gone now. Bridget stood there watching him, not sitting down, not offering any explanation, just observing his reaction with clinical detachment. As he read through the documents, his stomach dropped. The house, their house, the one they bought together 7 years ago, the one where they'd planned to raise children, gone. She wanted it. Most of their savings, the money they'd both contributed to over the years, gone. She wanted that too. And then the real kicker, 5 years of spousal support. Him paying her. The woman who made nearly twice what he did as a shop teacher. When Edward looked up and told her she had to be kidding with those numbers, Bridget didn't even blink. She wasn't kidding. Not even a little bit. She crossed her arms more tightly and told him to be realistic, to face facts. She reminded him, as if he needed reminding, that he was just a shop teacher at a public high school. She said she knew he couldn't afford to fight this, that hiring a lawyer would bury him in legal fees before he even got started, that he'd end up with even less if he tried to contest anything. She laid it all out so matter-of-factly, like she was explaining a simple math problem to a slow student, like he was a business obstacle she needed to navigate around. That's when Edward realized with crushing certainty that their marriage had been over for much longer than either of them had admitted. The woman standing in his kitchen, looking at him with those cold, calculating eyes, wasn't someone he recognized anymore. This wasn't the Bridget who'd laughed at his jokes, who'd cried at romantic movies, who'd held his hand during his mother's funeral. This was a stranger wearing his wife's face, speaking in his wife's voice, but with all the warmth and humanity drained out. Edward told her, his voice barely above a whisper, that she was probably right. He couldn't afford to fight. What could a high school shop teacher do against corporate lawyers and legal maneuvering? The smile that crossed Bridget's face when he said those words made his stomach turn. It wasn't a smile of relief or even sympathy. It was triumph. Pure, undisguised victory. She thought she'd already won. The game was over before it had even begun. She said she was glad he was being reasonable about it, glad he understood how things had to be. She told him she'd have the papers drawn up properly by the end of the week, and he could sign them the following Monday. Then they could both move on with their lives, get this unpleasantness behind them. She grabbed her designer purse from the counter and headed for the door like they'd just discussed weekend plans or what to have for dinner. The normalcy of her movements, the casual way she was ending 13 years of marriage, was almost more shocking than the divorce itself. Edward asked, his voice cracking slightly, if that was it. Just like that. After everything they'd been through together? Bridget paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and turned back to look at him. She asked what he expected, some big emotional scene? Screaming and crying and throwing things? She said they'd been going through the motions for years anyway, that this was just making it official, putting on paper what they both already knew. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Edward sat there alone, staring at his bowl of soggy cereal, the documents spread out on the table in front of him, feeling like his entire world had just collapsed. 13 years of marriage, and she'd ended it between breakfast and her morning commute with less emotion than most people showed when canceling a subscription service. Edward spent the next 3 days feeling like absolute garbage, like he'd been hit by a truck and left for dead on the side of the road. He called in sick to work, something he almost never did, and told them he had the flu. He couldn't face his students, couldn't pretend everything was normal when his life was falling apart. He sat around the house in his pajamas, moving from room to room like a ghost, seeing everything through new eyes. Everything looked different now, tainted by Bridget's coldness and calculation. The living room where they'd watched movies together on countless Friday nights. The kitchen where they'd cooked meals side by side, laughing and talking about their days. The bedroom where they'd made love, made plans, made promises to each other. Now it all looked like a movie set, props in a play that was ending. He kept seeing the house the way Bridget's lawyer probably saw it, square footage, market value, an asset to be divided and distributed. Not the place where they'd painted the bedroom together one long weekend, getting more paint on each other than on the walls. Not where she'd collapsed in tears when her father died, and he'd held her for hours while she sobbed. Just property. Just money. Edward kept replaying that Wednesday morning in his head, over and over like a song he couldn't get out of his mind. The way Bridget looked at him when she said he couldn't afford to fight. Not sad or apologetic or even guilty. Just calculating, cold, assessing. Like she'd already done the math on his weakness and found him wanting. That bothered him more than anything else, more than the divorce itself, more than losing the house or the money. It was the certainty in her eyes, the absolute confidence that he'd roll over and let her take everything without putting up even a token resistance. Maybe she was right to think that. After all, what was he? Just a high school shop teacher who showed teenagers how to use power tools safely, how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand wood until it was smooth. Bridget's lawyer probably charged more per hour than Edward made in an entire week. What chance did he have against that kind of firepower? What chance did he have against someone who did this professionally, who knew all the tricks and loopholes and legal maneuvers? But something about Bridget's smugness, about that triumphant smile when he'd agreed with her, wouldn't let Edward sleep. He'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and see that smile over and over. The way she looked at him like he was exactly as pathetic and helpless as she'd expected him to be. Like she'd married beneath herself and was finally correcting that mistake. Like he was a problem she'd solve with ruthless efficiency. Then, on the third day of his self-imposed isolation, Edward remembered his brother James. They hadn't talked in 5 years, not since their parents had died and left them their house. It had started a stupid fight that had spiraled out of control. Edward had wanted to keep the house, to maintain it as a connection to their childhood, to the parents they'd lost. James had wanted to sell it, to split the money and move on. They'd both said things in the heat of the moment, terrible things they couldn't take back. Accusations flew. Old childhood grievances were dredged up. And then the silence had stretched between them, days turning into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, until the idea of calling felt impossible, like crossing an ocean without a boat. But James knew lawyers. Good ones. He was some kind of hotshot attorney himself, working for a major firm in the city, handling corporate litigation, mostly. Divorces weren't his specialty, but he moved in those circles, knew who the heavy hitters were, knew who could go toe-to-toe with the best and come out on top. Edward sat on his couch, phone in hand, staring at James's number for a full 20 minutes before he worked up the courage to dial. His heart pounded as the phone rang. Part of him expected James to see his name on the caller ID and just let it go to voicemail. Part of him expected his brother to answer and immediately hang up. They hadn't exactly parted on good terms. But on the third ring, James picked up and his voice, so familiar despite the years of silence, said hello. Edward could hear the surprise in his brother's voice when he identified himself. There was a long pause, and then James called him little brother, just like he used to when they were kids, and asked what was wrong. Something in that simple question, that immediate assumption that Edward needed help, broke through the dam Edward had built around his emotions. Everything came pouring out in a rush. Bridget's cold announcement, her impossible demands, her smug lawyer, her absolute certainty that Edward would roll over and take whatever she offered because he was too weak and too poor to fight back. When Edward finished his rambling explanation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then James asked him to repeat what Bridget had said about not being able to afford a lawyer. Edward told him again, word for word, the way she dismissed him so casually. And something in James's voice changed, got colder, harder, more focused. It was the voice of someone who'd just been challenged, who'd just heard something that offended him on a fundamental level. James said, in a tone that sent shivers down Edward's spine, that there was no way in hell Bridget was going to get away with that. No way she was going to steamroll his little brother just because she thought she could. He asked when Edward's first hearing was scheduled. Edward told him next Wednesday. James said he'd be there. He told Edward not to sign anything, not to agree to anything, not to even talk to Bridget about the divorce. And whatever he did, he absolutely could not let her think he was planning to fight back. Edward asked why the secrecy, why the deception. James explained it like a chess match. Right now, Bridget thought she had Edward completely figured out. She'd calculated his weakness, assessed his resources, and determined he was no threat. Better to let her keep thinking that, let her stay confident and comfortable, while they figured out what she was really up to, what she was hiding, because James's experience told him that anyone who pushed this hard, this fast, was definitely hiding something. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click like if you enjoy this story. I always read your comments and analyze which stories you like best so that I can create better stories. Thank you. I will continue the story. When they hung up, Edward sat there with his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins, wondering what the hell he'd just set in motion. But for the first time in 3 days, for the first time since Bridget had dropped that folder on the kitchen table, he didn't feel completely helpless. There was a spark of something in his chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as powerless as Bridget thought. The weekend that followed was the longest of Edward's life, a strange limbo between his old life and whatever was coming next. Bridget acted as if absolutely nothing had changed, as if she hadn't just dropped a nuclear bomb on their marriage 3 days earlier. She chatted about her day at work over dinner, asked what he wanted to eat, commented on the weather, talked about a new restaurant she wanted to try. It was surreal, like living with a stranger who was playing the role of his wife, but had never actually read the script properly. Saturday night, Bridget went out with her girlfriends. She said they were celebrating her friend Rachel's promotion at work, that they'd be at some wine bar downtown. She came home late around midnight, happy and loose from too much wine, talking and laughing on the phone as she came through the door. She was in high spirits, practically glowing, and she talked about how good it felt to finally be making some big changes in her life, to be taking control, to be moving forward instead of staying stuck. She told Edward, as she kicked off her heels and dropped her purse on the counter, that she'd realized something important that night. She said she'd been playing it safe for too long, staying in situations that weren't making her happy just because they were comfortable, because they were familiar, because change was scary. But not anymore. She was done settling, done compromising, done accepting less than what she deserved. Edward was loading the dishwasher, trying to act normal, trying to keep his face neutral even though his mind was racing. He made some non-committal comment about how everyone wants different things out of life, how sometimes people grow apart. Bridget got excited at that, like he'd finally understood something important. She said exactly, yes, that's exactly it. Sometimes you have to have the courage to pursue what you really want, even if it means hurting people you care about. Even if it means burning bridges and starting over. She was talking about him, Edward realized. He was the comfortable situation she was leaving behind. He was the person she was willing to hurt in pursuit of whatever great thing she thought was waiting for her on the other side of this divorce. And the thing that struck him most was that she didn't sound like someone who was hurting, someone who was making a difficult but necessary choice. She sounded excited, energized, like someone about to start a great adventure. She'd already mentally moved on to whatever was next, whoever was next. Sunday was more of the same strange disconnect. Bridget spent most of the day on her phone, texting constantly, and taking calls in other rooms. When Edward asked about it casually, trying not to sound suspicious, she said it was work stuff. Her boss was working on some special project and wanted her input, needed her expertise. But Edward noticed she always took the calls in the other room, always lowered her voice when he walked by, always angled her phone away from him when she was texting. That night in bed, Bridget turned her back to him almost immediately and fell asleep in minutes, her breathing deep and even. Edward lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she'd been planning all of this. How many nights had she fallen asleep next to him while dreaming about her lawyer and her settlement and whatever new life she was building in secret? How many times had she kissed him goodnight while mentally calculating how much she could take from him? Walking into that courthouse the following Wednesday felt like walking into his own execution, like he was a condemned man taking those final steps to the gallows. Edward's hands were sweating, his heart was racing, and he felt like everyone could see right through him. Just another sad sack about to get cleaned out by someone who knew how the system worked, about to learn an expensive lesson about being outmatched and outgunned. Bridget was already there when he arrived, and she wasn't alone. Her lawyer stood next to her, both of them looking like they owned the place, like they'd done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly how it was going to end. Bridget was wearing a sharp blue suit that probably cost more than Edward made a month, looking every inch the successful professional woman. They were actually laughing about something when Edward walked in, sharing some private joke, completely at ease. Her lawyer noticed Edward first and came over with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was smooth, professional, perfectly groomed, the kind of lawyer you saw in commercials promising to fight for you. He said he hoped Edward had had time to think about their proposal, to really consider what was being offered. He said they could wrap this whole unpleasant business up today if Edward was ready to be sensible, to be realistic about his situation and his options. Edward told him, his voice steadier than he felt, that he was waiting for his attorney. The lawyer's eyebrows went up slightly, and he actually chuckled, a condescending sound that made Edward's jaw clench. He asked what attorney Edward could possibly have found on a teacher's salary. He probably thought Edward had scraped together enough money for some cut-rate ambulance chaser, someone fresh out of law school looking for experience. He told Edward, in that patronizing tone people use when they think they're being helpful, not to make this harder than it needed to be. He said his client, Bridget, was being very generous, that most judges would likely give her a lot more than what she was currently asking for, that Edward should count his blessings and sign the papers. Edward wanted to punch him right there in the courthouse hallway. The condescending tone, the fake concern, the way he talked about Edward's house and Edward's savings as if they were prizes Bridget deserved for putting up with him all these years. But Edward just stood there and said quietly that he'd wait for his attorney. The lawyer shrugged like Edward was making a foolish choice, but was his funeral, and walked back to where Bridget was standing. Edward could see them talking, could see the lawyer saying something to Bridget, could see her glance over at him with what looked like pity. Poor Edward, she was probably thinking. Too stubborn to know when he's beaten. Too proud to accept reality. She'd find out soon enough how wrong she was. That's when the courtroom doors opened with a bang, and James walked in like he owned the building. The reaction was immediate and electric. Whispers started spreading through the waiting area like wildfire. Lawyers who'd been chatting casually suddenly stood up straighter, paying attention. Court staff who'd been shuffling papers stopped and stared. People who clearly recognized James nudged each other and pointed. This was someone important, someone with a reputation that preceded him. James walked straight over to Edward and sat down next to him at one of the benches, squeezing his shoulder in a gesture of brotherly support and solidarity. He apologized for being late, said traffic getting into the city had been absolutely horrible, but he was here now and ready to go. Edward looked over at Bridget, and the transformation on her face was everything he could have hoped for. The smug, confident expression had melted off her face like ice cream on a hot summer day. She looked pale, shocked, like she'd just seen a ghost or received terrible news. Her lawyer looked even worse. All the smoothness and confidence had evaporated, replaced by something that looked a lot like panic. When the judge finally called their case, and they all filed into the courtroom, James stood up and announced himself in a clear, confident voice as attorney for the defendant. Even the judge, who'd probably seen everything in her years on the bench, raised her eyebrows slightly. Everyone in that courtroom knew James's reputation. He wasn't just any lawyer. He was the lawyer you called when you absolutely, positively had to win, when losing wasn't an option, when you needed someone who could tear apart the opposition's case and leave nothing but rubble. James turned to look at Bridget and her lawyer, and the smile he gave them made Edward think of a shark circling its prey. It was polite, professional, and absolutely predatory. He apologized for any delay his late arrival might have caused, then looked directly at Bridget, making eye contact in a way that made her squirm in her seat. He said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, that just so they were all clear on the financial arrangements, Edward didn't need to worry about affording his services. Family discount, he said. Family takes care of family. The transformation was instant and complete. Bridget went pale, all the color draining from her face. Her lawyer started sweating visibly, loosening his tie, shuffling through papers like he'd lost something critically important. The confident team that had walked in ready to steamroll Edward, ready to wrap this up in one quick hearing, suddenly looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. James addressed the judge directly, his tone respectful but firm. He said they'd need time to review the petitioner's claims thoroughly and conduct their own investigation into the marital assets. There were discrepancies that needed to be examined, questions that needed to be answered. He moved for a continuance, for time to do proper due diligence. Bridget's lawyer immediately objected, arguing that this was a straightforward dissolution of marriage with no need for delays or complications, that they should proceed today, as scheduled. The judge looked at James, looked at Bridget's lawyer, and overruled the objection without even a moment's hesitation. Motion granted. 30 days. Next hearing would be scheduled for a month out. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Game over, at least for round one. As they filed out of the courtroom, Edward could see Bridget and her lawyer huddled together, talking in urgent, angry whispers. Her perfect plan, her easy victory, had just gotten a lot more complicated. And this was only the beginning. The next few months were like watching a masterclass in legal warfare, like watching a surgeon dissect a patient with absolute precision and no wasted motion. James didn't just practice law. He wielded it like a weapon, like an artist uses a brush, with skill and purpose and devastating effectiveness. He told Edward that if Bridget was pushing this hard for a quick settlement, if she was this confident and this aggressive, then she was definitely hiding something. People who had nothing to hide didn't act like this. People who were being honest and fair didn't try to steamroll their spouses into signing away everything without even seeing a lawyer. The first thing James did was demand every financial document Bridget had touched in the last 3 years. Bank statements, credit card bills, work expense reports, tax returns, investment accounts, everything. When her lawyer tried to fight it, tried to argue that it was invasive and unnecessary, the judge took one look at James's reputation and his carefully worded motion and approved every single request. Bridget was ordered to produce everything or face contempt charges. The documents started arriving in boxes, hundreds of pages of financial records that James and his team went through with meticulous care. Edward sat in James's office one afternoon, surrounded by stacks of paper, and watched his brother work. James had spreadsheets open on multiple monitors, tracking patterns, following money trails, looking for anomalies. After reviewing the first batch of documents, James looked up at Edward with a grim expression and said that Bridget had definitely been planning something. The spending patterns weren't normal, weren't consistent with their lifestyle or her known expenses. That's when they found it, a secret credit card that was linked to their joint savings account, but that Edward had never seen statements for. The card had been opened 18 months ago, and spending pattern on it was revealing and damning. Hotel charges at expensive places, jewelry stores, high-end restaurants, all on dates when Bridget had told Edward she was working late or visiting her sister or out with girlfriends. The amounts were substantial, thousands of dollars every month, money that had been flowing out of their joint account without Edward's knowledge or consent. James spread the credit card statements across his desk like a detective laying out evidence at a crime scene, showing Edward the pattern he'd discovered. Every 2 weeks, sometimes 3 times a week, charges at hotels and restaurants in the same area of town, an upscale neighborhood. Edward and Bridget never went together. The dates went back over a year, a consistent pattern of deception and spending. A year of lies, of Bridget coming home and kissing Edward goodnight after spending his money on someone else, after being with someone else. James told Edward what he'd probably already guessed, but hadn't wanted to admit. Bridget had been planning this divorce for at least a year, probably longer. She'd been funding an affair with Edward's money, setting everything up, getting all her pieces in position before making her move. The affair itself wasn't surprising, not really. Edward had suspected something was off, had noticed Bridget becoming more distant, more secretive. But seeing it laid out in black and white, documented in credit card statements and hotel receipts, hit different. It made it real in a way that suspicions never could. It wasn't just that Bridget wanted to leave. That would have been bad enough. But she'd been actively cheating on him while simultaneously planning his financial destruction, while setting him up to lose everything they'd built together. The cruelty of it, the calculated nature of it, took Edward's breath away. James scheduled depositions with everyone in Bridget's orbit. Her friends, her co-workers, even her sister. He was unfailingly polite, always professional, but absolutely ruthless in his questioning. He explained to each of them that he needed to understand Bridget's state of mind, her intentions, her planning. When did she start talking about divorce? Who knew about it? How long had this been going on? What had she said about Edward? About her plans for the future? Most of them tried to dodge, to deflect, to protect Bridget. But James was patient, working through their evasions and half-truths with the skill of someone who'd been doing this for decades. He'd circle back to inconsistencies, point out contradictions, slowly tightening the noose of their own testimony around them. The real breakthrough came when James questioned Bridget's best friend Brittany. She'd known Bridget since college, had been her maid of honor at the wedding, was someone Bridget confided in about everything. Brittany tried to cover for Bridget at first, insisting she didn't know anything about an affair, that Bridget had just been unhappy in her marriage, and decided to end it. She stuck to that story for about an hour, deflecting James's questions with practiced ease. But then James showed her the financial evidence, printouts of the credit card statements, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, jewelry purchases. He laid them out one by one, building a timeline, showing the pattern. And then he asked her again, very calmly, very directly, about the other man. He reminded her, his voice gentle but firm, that she was under oath, that lying in a deposition was perjury, that there were serious consequences for not telling the truth. Brittany went pale, her hands shaking slightly as she looked at the evidence spread across the table. And then the whole story came tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. His name was Reuben, a real estate developer with money, with an expensive house in that upscale neighborhood where all those credit card charges originated, with everything Edward wasn't. They'd met at some work function about 18 months ago. The timeline matched perfectly with when the secret credit card had been opened. It had started innocently enough, or so Brittany claimed. Just flirtation at first, chemistry between two people at a boring corporate event. Then coffee meetings to discuss business. Then lunch dates that stretched longer and longer. And eventually weekend getaways that Bridget had told Edward were work-related conferences or girls' trips with friends. Brittany admitted she'd covered for Bridget multiple times, had provided alibis, had lied to Edward's face when he called looking for his wife. Brittany said, her voice shaking now with emotion, guilt or fear or both, that Bridget had told her months ago that she was going to leave Edward anyway. The marriage was already over in Bridget's mind. She just needed to figure out the logistics, how to extract herself with maximum financial benefit and minimum fuss. Logistics. That's what Edward's 13-year marriage had been reduced to. A logistical problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome on Bridget's path to her new life with Reuben. When James finally got to depose Reuben himself, the encounter was everything Edward could have hoped for. Reuben showed up in an expensive suit with a confident smirk, playing the role of successful businessman who couldn't be intimidated by some lawyer. He sat down like he was doing them a favor, like this was all beneath him, but he'd humor them for an hour, and then get back to his important life. James let him sit there with that smirk for about 40 minutes, asking seemingly innocuous questions about his business, his lifestyle, his social circle. And then he pivoted, the questions getting sharper, more pointed, more uncomfortable. Within minutes, that confident facade started to crack. The smirk faded. The relaxed posture tensed up. Reuben started hedging his answers, trying to be careful, realizing too late that he was in over his head. Eventually, under relentless questioning, Reuben admitted to the affair. Admitted they'd been seeing each other for over a year. Admitted they'd been planning a future together, that they'd talked about Bridget moving in with him once the divorce was finalized. And then came the part that made Edward's blood boil. Reuben admitted it had been his idea for Bridget to go after the house and demand spousal support. James asked him, in that same calm, measured tone he'd used throughout the deposition, what exactly he'd told Bridget about Edward. Reuben hesitated, clearly realizing he was about to say something damaging, but he was under oath and James had already caught him in enough small eyes that he knew better than to try another one. So he told the truth. He said he'd told Bridget that Edward seemed like a pushover, like someone who wouldn't fight back. That if she played it right, acted confident, got aggressive, she could probably get everything, and Edward would be too scared or too broke or too beaten down to do anything about it. James asked what had made Reuben think Edward was a pushover. The answer made Edward's fists clench under the table. Reuben said Bridget had told him all about Edward. How he was just a shop teacher, how he'd never been in a real fight in his life, how he avoided conflict, how he always took the path of least resistance. She'd painted a picture of Edward as weak, passive, someone who could be manipulated and controlled. And Reuben had believed her, had encouraged her, had helped her plan Edward's destruction because they both thought he was too pathetic to fight back. They'd spent months planning it together, Reuben and Bridget, discussing strategy over expensive dinners that Edward had unknowingly paid for, laughing about how easy it would be, fantasizing about their future together once they'd gotten rid of the deadweight that was Edward and his boring, middle-class life. They'd been so certain, so confident, so completely sure that Edward would just sign whatever papers they put in front of him and slink away defeated. They were wrong. So very catastrophically wrong. By the time they reached the final hearing, Bridget's case had been systematically destroyed, torn apart piece by piece until there was nothing left but lies and fraud and deception. James had documented everything with brutal thoroughness. Perjury in her initial filings where she'd failed to disclose assets and income, hidden financial accounts, fraud in using marital funds for her affair, conspiracy with Reuben to manipulate the divorce proceedings. The night before the final court date, Bridget's lawyer called James in a panic, begging to settle. Bridget would drop all her demands, he said. She'd give up her claim on the house, give up the spousal support request, just let her walk away clean, and they'd call it even. James listened to the whole pitch, and then said no. He said walking away clean was what Bridget should have done 18 months ago, before she started cheating, before she started stealing, before she started planning to destroy Edward's life. Now she could face the consequences of her choices. The final hearing itself was almost anticlimactic after months of legal warfare. Bridget sat at her table looking like she'd aged 5 years in 5 months. All the confidence, all the smugness, all the self-assured superiority was gone. She couldn't even look at Edward, couldn't meet his eyes. She sat hunched over, pale and drawn, while her lawyer made increasingly desperate arguments that fell flat. Her lawyer tried arguing that adultery was irrelevant in a no-fault divorce state, that the court should just split everything 50-50 and let both parties move on with their lives. But James had prepared for that argument, had anticipated it, and built his case around more than just the affair. James addressed the judge directly, laying out his case with precision. This wasn't just about adultery, he explained. This was about systematic fraud. Bridget had hidden assets, lied about her intentions, used marital funds for personal benefit, and attempted to manipulate Edward into accepting terms that would have left him financially devastated while she walked away with everything. She'd committed perjury in her initial filings, had conspired with her paramour to defraud her husband, had shown a pattern of deception and manipulation that went far beyond a simple desire to end an unhappy marriage. James laid it all out methodically, the secret credit card, the hidden spending, the planning with Reuben to take everything Edward had worked for, the lies told under oath, the calculated cruelty of it all. The judge listened without expression, occasionally asking questions that made Bridget's lawyer sweat through his expensive shirt, that made Bridget herself look like she might be sick. When the judge finally issued her ruling, it wasn't the complete destruction you'd see in a movie, but it was justice. Real, tangible justice. Bridget got nothing from a house. It stayed Edward's entirely, his name alone, on the deed. No spousal support, despite her initial demand for 5 years of payments. She had to pay back every penny she'd stolen from their joint accounts to fund her affair with Reuben, money that would go directly back to Edward. And perhaps most satisfying of all, she had to cover Edward's legal fees, which given James's usual billing rates, was a substantial amount. Bridget left the marriage with less than she'd brought into it, burdened with a pile of legal bills that would take her years to pay off, and with a public record of her lies and fraud that would follow her forever. Her perfect plan had imploded spectacularly. The final twist came about a week after the divorce was finalized. James heard through his network, because lawyers always know everything, that Reuben had dumped Bridget. The moment things got complicated, the moment her lies became public record, the moment she stopped being a fun secret and became a messy problem, he'd vanished. Apparently, having Edward's wife as a mistress was exciting. Having Bridget as a broke, disgraced girlfriend with legal problems was significantly less appealing. Bridget had burned her entire marriage down, had destroyed 13 years and a life they'd built together for a guy who disappeared the second things got difficult. She'd traded everything for nothing, had sacrificed the real for the imaginary, had gambled everything on a future that never existed except in her own deluded fantasies. But for Edward, the best part of everything that had happened wasn't the money or keeping a house, or even seeing Bridget face consequences for her actions. The best part was getting his brother back, reconnecting with James after 5 years of stubborn, stupid silence. They drove out to their parents' place a few weeks after everything was settled, after all the papers were signed and filed, and the divorce was officially final. The house had been sitting empty for 5 years, slowly falling apart while Edward and James were too proud and too angry to talk to each other. The grass was overgrown, the paint was peeling, some of the windows had cracked. It looked sad and neglected, a physical manifestation of their broken relationship. They spent the afternoon just walking around the property, remembering what it had been like to be kids there. They found the old tire swing their dad had hung from a massive oak tree in the backyard, the rope rotted through now, but the tire still there. They walked through the garden their mom had babied every summer, now overrun with weeds, but still showing hints of the careful planning she'd put into it. They sat on the porch where their parents used to sit every evening, talking about their day, watching the sunset, just being together. James told Edward, his voice heavy with regret, that he'd been wrong about the place. He'd gotten so focused on the money, on the practical aspects of their parents' estate, that he'd forgotten what the house actually meant. It wasn't just property to be sold and divided. It was their childhood, their memories, their connection to the people who'd raised them and loved them and shaped who they'd become. Edward admitted he'd been wrong too. He'd been too stubborn, too rigid, unable to see James's perspective or consider any option except keeping everything exactly as it was. They'd both let their pride and their grief turn into anger, and that anger had cost them 5 years of brotherhood. They decided that day, sitting on that old porch in the fading sunlight, to keep the house and fix it up together. Not as some kind of shrine to the past, frozen in time like a museum, but as a project for their future. Something that would give them an excuse to stay in touch, to rebuild what they'd almost lost to stubbornness and silence. Something they could work on together, side by side, the way they used to help their dad with projects when they were kids. Now, every weekend, Edward and James drive out to the house with tools and supplies. They're not professional contractors, not even particularly skilled handymen, but they're figuring it out together. Replacing rotted boards, fixing ancient plumbing, repainting rooms that hadn't been touched since they were children. Sometimes they work in comfortable silence. Sometimes they talk, really talk, about their lives, their regrets, their hopes. Sometimes they laugh about old memories or argue good-naturedly about the best way to fix something. It's slow work, progress measured in inches rather than miles, but that's okay. They've got time now. They've got each other again. And that's worth more than any house, any amount of money, any quick victory. Edward thinks sometimes about how Bridget thought she was so smart, thought she had it all figured out. She'd found what she saw as a weak husband she could manipulate, and she'd found a rich boyfriend she could upgrade to. She had a perfect plan mapped out in her mind. Take everything from a pathetic shop teacher and move on to the successful developer, trade up to a better life with a better man. She probably imagined herself in Reuben's expensive house, living a life of luxury funded by Edward's losses. But Bridget made one crucial, fatal mistake in all her planning and scheming and manipulation. She underestimated what family means when it really matters. She thought Edward's isolation made him weak, thought his lack of connections made him vulnerable. She had no idea that her greed and her arrogance and her cruelty would force Edward to make the one call that would change everything, the call that brought James back into his life. Her parting shot, that smug declaration that Edward couldn't afford a lawyer, was supposed to be the final nail in his coffin. Instead, it was the catalyst that reunited two brothers, that healed a 5-year wound, that brought back the most important relationship in Edward's life. She thought she was isolating him, cutting him off from any possible help. Instead, she gave him exactly the push he needed to reach out, to bridge that gap, to reconnect with the person who mattered most. Bridget tried to leave Edward with nothing. No house, no savings, no dignity, no hope. But in her cruelty and her calculation, she inadvertently gave him everything back that actually counted. The house, yes. Financial security, certainly. But more importantly, his self-respect, his dignity, his sense of worth, and his brother. His family. The things that actually matter in life, the things money can't buy and lawyers can't argue over. Not bad for a shop teacher who supposedly couldn't afford a lawyer. Not bad for a man his wife had written off as weak and pathetic and beaten. Sometimes the person you think is weak turns out to be stronger than you expected, stronger than they even expected themselves to be. Sometimes the family you've written off, the relationships you've let die through neglect and pride, turn out to be the ones that show up when you need them most. And sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you, the most painful and difficult challenge you've ever faced, turns out to be exactly what you needed to become who you were meant to be. Edward's ex-wife Bridget is probably still wondering where it all went wrong, how her perfect plan fell apart so completely and so spectacularly. But Edward knows exactly where she made her mistake, can pinpoint the exact moment her scheme began to unravel. She forgot that quiet doesn't mean weak. She forgot that humble doesn't mean helpless. And most importantly, she forgot that even shop teachers, even regular guys living regular lives, have family. Have people who will stand up for them when it matters. Have brothers who will drop everything and fight like hell to protect them. And that, in the end, made all the difference. Thank you for watching this video. YouTube may no longer suggest my channel to you, so subscribe to it to receive new, interesting stories. You will also help the channel grow and improve the quality of its content. The screen now displays a playlist with other interesting stories that you can listen to. You can also write in the comments what stories you would like to see on the channel.